The world we are living in began to crack long before anyone noticed. I say this not to frighten you, and not to paint a Hollywood-style doomsday scene, but because there are mornings when you open your eyes and feel that something is no longer standing as firmly as before, even though everything on the surface still looks strangely peaceful. That feeling is as light as a breeze brushing the back of your neck, so fragile you could ignore it, yet it leaves an unnamed emptiness in your chest. It is like touching the wall of the house you have lived in for many years and realizing it is colder than usual, as if a thin fracture is spreading inside the cement where your eyes cannot reach. Imagine stepping outside on an autumn morning, the sky politely gray, not threatening but not welcoming either. You walk past familiar shops, the lights still glowing, but on the shelves are long, empty spaces, neat in a way that feels frightening, as if someone cleared everything out overnight. The shopkeeper smiles out of habit, but in their eyes something is drifting away, separating from who they are. The bank is still open, the system still running, but something in those numbers has lost its strength. Money, the symbol of order, suddenly feels as light as a piece of paper folded too many times. You look back at the people around you. Everyone is busy, walking briskly, carrying hot cups of coffee, bags, and long to-do lists. The surface of life is noisy, yet beneath it is a faint sound like wood slowly rotting in the dark. Even though no one speaks about it, you can feel a question running through every glance and every breath. Are we standing on something that is slowly weakening while we are too busy to notice? What is frightening is not a loud explosion, but the silence before it. Not the crashing sound of a burning building, but the feeling of the ground sinking 1 millimeter at a time with no one noticing. We have always believed the system, the thing that feeds, organizes, and orders the world, is a solid rock that cannot be shaken. We believe it is strong because it was here before we were born. We believe it is right because people have repeated that belief like a mantra for a century. Yet there are quiet moments when you stand in a familiar city and suddenly realize that this place no longer carries the promise it once did. And then, like a soft wind brushing your neck, a bigger question arrives. What happens when a system does not fall because of war or disaster, but because of the weight of its own contradictions piling up every day? Something that can withstand bombs, yet loses to the burden it places on people. The small gears forced to keep turning endlessly. For many years we believed that as long as we tried harder, woke up a bit earlier, sacrificed a little more, everything would get better. We were taught that the world rewards hard work, that freedom is within reach, that success can be measured by bank accounts or the new things we buy. But no one told us that sometimes the system is like a ladder missing a few rungs. You can climb it, but the higher you go, the more exhausted you become instead of rising. Some people climb until they collapse, only to discover the ladder leads to a wall so tall that even light struggles to pass through. When you look closely, you see the signs have been here for a long time. People working more but living less. Families so busy they barely talk. Long nights where someone lies awake because they feel they are falling behind in a race no one knows the finish line of. And sometimes you wonder whether we are living inside a story that has expired but we are too afraid to admit it. The strange thing is that every time a crack appears, society tries to paint over it with a fresh layer. When prices rise, people are told to try harder. When jobs disappear, people are told to start their own business, to build their personal brand. When you're so tired that joy slips from your hands, people say you simply have not managed your time well enough. No one tells you that maybe the problem is not you, but the thing you are living inside, a machine too old to hold the weight of a new generation. On days like that, when you walk past the glass of a shop that is closed unexpectedly early, your reflection sometimes makes you pause. Not because you look different, but because the eyes in the mirror seem to ask you something you have avoided for a long time. Are we relying on a system that no longer serves people, but survives only out of inertia? And if that is true, then collapse, in some form, is no longer a question of whether it will happen, but when, and whether it has already begun. There is a clear sense that the world we are stepping into is not an ending, but the border between two eras. On one side are old beliefs and ancient promises. On the other is a strange land with no name yet, growing quietly in the awareness of humanity. And the most dangerous place is the space between these two shores, where everything feels both familiar and strange, both safe and fragile. This is where the story begins. at the threshold, in the dim light of an old world shrinking back and the first spark of something new trying to emerge. You may not see this clearly every day, but if you observe in silence, you will notice the world changing from within, like an old wooden door starting to warp under the moisture. No one knows when it will burst open, but everyone can sense that something is approaching. And perhaps the greatest question of our time is not whether we can stop it from falling, but what we will do when the first light slips through the cracks. From the moment you notice those cracks, the world around you begins to appear with sharper lines, as if someone turned up the contrast of life. The things you once assumed were obvious suddenly become questions waiting for answers, and right there, you see a truth that was skillfully hidden. The system we trusted for so long has not always stood with people. Sometimes it has stood only with itself. Long ago, people said that the foundation of everything was built on 3 pillars: personal effort, the freedom to choose, and fair rewards for those who work hard. It sounds simple, reasonable, even beautiful, like a modern fairy tale. But when you look more closely, you see the dark corners that story avoids. It does not speak much about those who worked their whole lives yet still stood at the edge of enough. It does not mention the dreams that broke before ever touching the light. It does not mention the families who traded more than what they received. And most of all, it does not mention the invisible feeling many people carry, the feeling of walking on a long carpet that could be pulled away at any moment. You begin to notice a great contradiction between what is promised and what is lived. People work more, produce more, yet their sense of stability shrinks like a weak flame in a windy night. The middle class, once considered the backbone of society, is fading like a bulb with a damaged filament. A home, once the standard dream, has become a luxury. Education, once promised as the path upward, has turned into a debt that follows the young for years. None of this happened overnight. It happened slowly, quietly, like water draining beneath the earth, leaving the surface dry while the foundation below grows hollow. And then you realize there is a subtle confusion between promise and reality. The promise says anyone can reach success if they work hard. Reality whispers that the running track is tilted, and the tilt is not in your imagination. People say this is a fair race, but those who start ahead always have the wind behind them, while those behind seem to run through wet sand. The difference does not lie in willpower or talent, but in position, something no one gets to choose at birth. History has shown us glorious eras that eroded by the very processes that once created them. Empires, bright as the midday sun, faded because they could not hear the sighs of the people living inside them. Systems that seemed strong rotted from within, not because of enemies, but because of the blind confidence that they were untouchable. When a social structure no longer meets the needs of the majority, it becomes like a wooden bridge eaten by termites. No loud sound, only small, slow, certain cracks. In this era, we hear those cracks everywhere. In statistics showing widening inequality, in news about rising housing costs, rising medicine costs, rising living expenses, and in sudden conversations between friends about how no one feels the future is safe anymore. People are tired not only because of work, but because they feel they are holding on to something that can no longer carry them. They worry not only about money, but about the loss of trust in tomorrow. The harshest truth of this system is that it demands great sacrifices without guaranteeing anything lasting. You can spend decades climbing toward a position, but a single shift in the wind can take it away. One ordinary day, you realize the only security the system ever promised was another version of chance, and in that clarity, you begin to ask whether all the effort you poured in has been falling into a bottomless well. It is not easy to admit this, because accepting that the system is no longer solid means accepting that many of our past decisions were built on fragile beliefs. But truth has an old habit. It always returns, no matter how far we run from it. And when you look at life with eyes no longer fogged, you see that some promises no longer have the strength to support a generation facing climate change, job crises, rising costs of living, and wages standing still like a needle stuck in place. Strangely, even knowing all this, the world keeps moving as if nothing is wrong. People work, consume, dream, try, fail, and continue, like a train still rolling forward while the rails beneath it begin to bend. No one wants to stop and look directly at it, because the fear of what remains if this system disappears is greater than any truth. But perhaps that is why this conversation matters even more. Because if the weakness of a structure lies in the silence of the people living inside it, its strength appears when we begin to see clearly and dare to question again, when we recognize that things may not be falling apart suddenly, but dissolving layer by layer, slow enough to avoid panic yet fast enough for the sensitive to feel. When this thought begins to touch you each day, you sense a tightness somewhere in your chest, like an old door opening slightly and the first gust of wind lifting the dust into a faint cloud. You do not see anything clearly yet, but you know something is changing. And perhaps in that place, this story will continue, where old beliefs are too tired to hold their shape, and new questions begin to demand to be heard. When those questions begin to echo, even if only in the silence of your inner world, you will notice the outside world changing in a very strange way, not through big events, but through details so small you could miss them if you do not look closely. An advertisement you have passed 100 times suddenly feels more obvious. A brand you once found familiar now looks like a shiny mask hiding emptiness inside. An item you once desired loses its charm the moment you touch it. All of these things are like stage props that someone has suddenly lit up, allowing you to see the thin strings floating in the air for the first time. That is when you realize that modern life is not driven only by money and rules, but by desires quietly constructed beneath the surface. People do not buy things simply because of need, but because they want to appear as a better version of themselves in the eyes of someone else. A car is sold as a symbol of power. A watch is sold as a promise of respect. A coat is not there to keep you warm, but to hide the parts of yourself you believe are not good enough. All of these form a soft net that is hard to see, yet tight enough to hold you firmly. There are evenings when you sit in front of a screen, scrolling through items appearing one after another like restless waves. You are not tired, but you are not happier either. You buy something only to realize the satisfaction lasts a few minutes. Then the emptiness returns like a familiar guest, and from that moment, you understand that the lack you tried to fill is not in your drawers or your room, but deep in places that words cannot reach. Those empty spaces have no shape and no name, yet they are what keep people searching, consuming, hoping the next thing will give what the previous one could not. The system does not force you with chains. It persuades you with sweet invitations. It does not say you must. It says you deserve. It does not say obey. It says express yourself. And in that softness, you slowly forget how far you have been taken from the true starting point of your needs, to be understood, to be connected, to feel full from within your own life. The more you pay attention, the more you see that every app, every product, every advertisement aims straight at a vulnerable part of the human heart. The fear of being left behind, the need to be recognized, the longing to be loved, the anxiety of feeling inadequate if you do not keep up. There is nothing wrong with wanting to improve your life or take care of yourself, but there is a very thin line between doing better for yourself and chasing an image shaped by someone else. And many people have crossed that line without ever noticing. There are moments when you believe you bought something because you liked it, but in truth, a giant machine has whispered into your ear week after week, month after month, year after year that this is what will make you the right version of yourself. It is hard to notice when it happens, because this kind of control does not hurt you. It keeps you busy. And sometimes busyness is the most effective way to stop you from asking questions. What is interesting is that this emptiness does not stop at material things. It slips into your work, where people are encouraged to do more, learn faster, expand their dreams, expand their abilities, expand everything. But no one talks about expanding your capacity to endure. No one talks about how a human being cannot stretch endlessly like a rubber band without breaking. Hustle culture, celebrated as a spirit of greatness, is sometimes only a polite version of exhaustion. People push themselves past their limits not because they want to, but because they fear that if they stop, they will fall into a shadowy place the system does not bother to shine a light on. In days like that, you begin to understand why the younger generation feels tired to the point of believing there is no escape. They are more connected, access information faster, have more choices, yet feel less belonging than any generation before them. Not because they are weak, but because they live in a world where personal value is constantly compared, measured, and priced. They grow up with a phone like an invisible mirror where every achievement must look beautiful. Every moment must be meaningful. Every emotion must be performed. And when people grow tired, the system offers the solution that created the problem in the first place. Buy more, refresh, upgrade, a spiral with no end, like a wheel turning endlessly just to keep people moving without ever arriving. That is why sometimes you feel as if you are running on a treadmill, sweating, heart pounding, yet staying in the same place. Strangely enough, it is in the moments when you stop to observe this mechanism that you see you are not alone. Someone in another city feels the same. Someone in another country is facing the same question. If you want, you can leave a thought under the video, or press subscribe as a way of marking that you too are on a journey of looking back at yourself. Not to support or follow a trend, but to remind yourself that some questions can only be answered when many people search together. Because in the end, what the system fears most is not violent resistance, but the quiet moments when people stop and begin to see the true shape of the invisible strings holding them back. And from that moment on, the story moves into a deeper layer, the layer of awareness, where the first light begins to slip through the cracks of a world that seems complete but is held together only by illusion. When that light enters, you begin to see another layer of truth once hidden beneath shiny promises. It is the truth about fairness, or more accurately, the illusion of fairness. For so long, people have been encouraged to believe that society works like an open playground, where anyone can climb any ladder if they have enough effort and will. That idea sounds beautiful. Like an inspiring story told in a morning classroom where teachers say the future is in your hands. But when you look at the real world, you see that the ladder is not straight. It leans toward those who never had to start from zero. Some families are born with networks, assets, and safety already in place. The young people there grow like seedlings placed in the perfect spot with sunlight, water, and good soil. Not because they are special, but because life favored them early. Meanwhile, others climb from rocky ground, carrying the weight of expectations and worries handed down from the generation before. When someone at the top says that success is only about effort, they sometimes forget that their path had no potholes like the ones others must avoid every day. This reality does not make anyone worse, but it makes the story of fairness incomplete. And when a promise is incomplete, it becomes a burden instead of motivation. People do not just have to run fast, they also carry the weight of self-blame every time they stumble. Maybe I'm not good enough. Maybe I did not try enough. Maybe I'm behind everyone else. No one says that sometimes disadvantage does not come from effort, but from the structure of a system designed to favor a few. You can see this in quiet conversations between friends about buying a home, changing careers, or simply trying to live without being crushed by debt. Everyone understands that some doors only open for those with certain keys, and those keys do not always come from talent or character. Some people need years to reach an opportunity that others receive in the first breath of their lives. Some must carve their own path, while others simply follow a road already paved. The strange thing is that society tries to keep the old story intact, as if changing it would cause chaos. People fear that if they admit the system is not fair, it will lose its legitimacy. So reassurances continue to be repeated. Try a little harder. Sacrifice a few more years. Trust that destiny sees everything. But destiny has never been the judge of fairness. It is only a name used to cover structures no one dares to speak about. A society cannot grow if it keeps telling people that their lack is a personal fault. And that is exactly how the system keeps itself standing, by making each person believe they only need to try a little more for everything to be better. But sometimes you look around and realize that no matter how hard you try, the horizon remains just as far. Inequality is not only the distance between two numbers, it is the distance between hope and reality, between promises and what people actually experience. You see it in economic crises, when millions lose their jobs because a few numbers on a report shift. You see it in protests, where people are not asking for privilege but asking to reclaim their humanity. You see it in strikes, where people stand in the summer heat or winter cold just to remind the world that they are human, not shadows in a system too large to remember individuals. And each time, you feel another crack widening by a few more inches. What makes these cracks matter is that they come from many directions: economic, social, environmental, emotional. Not one single problem, but hundreds of wounds asking to be healed at the same time. A healthy system can handle them one by one, but a tired system does not have the strength to hold everything steady. And in those moments, you understand that collapse is not always a loud explosion. Sometimes it is a long sigh, carrying the sense that everything has become too heavy to continue the old way. But the strangest part is this. Each crack is not only a sign of decay, but also an opening for light to enter. Not the light of salvation, but the light of truth. The truth that no system, no matter how powerful, can last forever if it becomes disconnected from the people holding it up. And when people begin to see that truth, they no longer move through life by inertia, they begin to question. It is these questions that shake the system the most, not resistance, not anger, but a quiet awakening spreading wider each day. People begin to ask, if this race is not fair, why should I keep running in it if the promises are no longer true? Why should I live as if they still matter if everything is wearing down? Why not search for another way to live? When these questions appear, you feel something shifting, very slowly, but very real, like standing on an old bridge and sensing a soft vibration through each plank. No one knows whether the bridge will break or simply needs repair, but everyone knows they can no longer pretend the shaking is not there. And in that realization, a new page of the story begins, where people no longer look only at what the system promises, but begin to understand how it truly operates. Because sometimes, to see the road ahead, you must dare to question the one you're standing on. From the moment people dare to look directly at those questions, something strange begins to happen. The concrete blocks of life, once thought unchangeable, suddenly feel softer, easier to move, not because the system chooses to change, but because the human gaze has shifted. As you walk through the city, there are moments when you feel as if you are looking at an old model built on supports that have worn down. The buildings, the advertisements, the rushing streets all begin to look like a stage set from another era, an era that believed growth was infinite and that humans could sacrifice anything to achieve it. But if you pay attention, you will see that in the smallest corners, the seeds of another world are quietly appearing. People begin to talk about living more slowly, not as a temporary trend, but as a natural response of the body and mind after generations stretched too thin. Somewhere, small communities choose to make their own food, share what they have in excess, and live by the rhythm of nature instead of the schedule of machines. Those simple choices suddenly hold greater meaning when placed in a society that constantly urges people to run without ever stopping. There are places in the world experimenting with new models, schools that follow the growth of students instead of chasing grades, cities that build budgets based on the real needs of their residents, organizations that give ownership to workers instead of only to shareholders. Some countries even measure their success not by GDP, but by satisfaction, mental well-being, the quality of human relationships. These models are not perfect, but they open a bold question that people once feared to ask. If there is another way to live, why must we cling to the old one? What makes this transformation interesting is that it does not follow the logic of political reform or loud slogans. It moves slowly, quietly, like a change in the weather. One day you look around and realize the young generation no longer desires what the previous generation saw as symbols of success: big houses, luxury cars, prestige. Instead, they search for meaning, for time, for balance that the old system cannot offer. They want to live closer to nature, to work in spaces that do not suffocate the spirit, to feel they are contributing to something that truly matters. When a new generation changes its dreams, the system cannot remain still. Every system is operated, nourished, and sustained by people. If people change direction, every structure must shift with them. That is why every small movement, every personal decision, every choice to live differently carries value, not because they can change the world instantly, but because they add to a larger current, a current of awareness moving away from old values. But the most important part is not the new models or new policies. It lies in the story humanity begins to tell itself again. Every system, whether economic or political, is built on a deep belief about human nature. For centuries, we lived by a story saying that humans are fundamentally selfish, that we function best when we compete, that if we are not pushed or pressured, we will stop growing. That story was so powerful it seeped into education, culture, and personal identity. It created a world where people fear falling behind more than they fear losing inner peace. But when cracks appear, we begin to ask, is that story even true, or is it only a myth repeated so long that people forget it was just one possibility, not a universal truth? When you look back at human history, you find other evidence. Communities built on sharing rather than hoarding, cultures that valued harmony more than competition, eras when people survived not by defeating one another, but by standing with one another. These memories are like old mirrors covered in dust by centuries of individualism, but when wiped clean, they reveal another nature, the nature of connection. Perhaps this is why the fall of the old system is not only its decay, but also the return of what was forgotten. People grow more eager for the idea of living in connection rather than competition. They seek belonging, authenticity, simple kindness, things that once seemed small. An evening without a phone, a home-cooked meal, an unrushed conversation. Now bring a sense of true living deeper than any list of achievements. On a larger scale, you see environmental movements not only calling to save the planet, but reminding humanity that we have drifted too far from natural rhythms. Young people standing on the streets of Paris, Berlin, New York are not only protesting climate change, they are saying they want a different story, one where existence is not about winning but about harmony. And perhaps that is what the old system cannot adapt to. It was built on the assumption that humans can only be guided through demands and rewards. But the new generation shows that they do not only want more. They want what is right, right for their nature, right for their limits, right for what nourishes the inner life. As these movements spread, you begin to understand that real change does not start where people expect. It does not start in parliaments, corporations, or official statements. It starts in small kitchens where families choose to live more simply, in groups of friends sharing what they have instead of buying new, in young people leaving the race for prestige to follow humble but peaceful work, in small communities beginning to ask, what is enough? And within all these movements, a growing awareness appears that the old system is not collapsing because of economic failure, but because it no longer fits the human soul. When the spirit of an era changes, old structures, no matter how solid, must step aside. From here, the story leads us to a deeper point. What happens when outer transformation begins to touch the inner world, when people not only change how they live, but also change how they see themselves? And at that intersection, a new stage begins to open, a stage of choices we once never dared to imagine. When this transformation reaches deep into the inner world, you begin to feel a change that is hard to name, like an underground stream quietly shifting its direction beneath your feet. It is not an explosion, not a sudden decision, but a silent awakening. You open your eyes in the morning and notice that the things that once worried you no longer carry their old weight, while the things you once considered small begin to speak more loudly. A meal with family, an afternoon sitting in the sun, a moment where you do not need to prove anything to anyone. These things become precious in ways you never recognized. Maybe for the first time in a long while, you feel you want a life with more depth than width. And then you find yourself no longer wanting to chase the measures of success that the system created. You look at them and realize they are not yours. They belong to an era that believed human worth was measured by output, achievements, and endurance. But inside you, something says that life is not measured by those numbers. It is measured by your presence in every moment, something the system made you forget for so long that it felt like it never existed. This shift leaves many people confused, even guilty, because when you want to slow down, to rest, to work less so you can breathe more, society asks, are you wasting your potential? But the better question is, potential for what? If a lifetime is spent chasing goals far from your heart, that is not potential, it is forgetting. And in the moment you understand that, people begin to refuse the paths they once believed were the only ones. You see it in those who quit high-paying jobs because their spirit is too tired to continue. You see it in those who leave big cities in search of a slower rhythm that can heal them. You see it in young artists choosing to keep their creativity pure instead of pleasing the market. You see it in people who live simply not to save money, but to live honestly. As these choices appear more often, you realize they are not running away from the world. They are walking toward their true selves. These small changes may look isolated, but they create ripples that spread far. When one person dares to say no to a meaningless race, others see they can do it too. When one family chooses to live with less, neighbors begin to wonder if they can change as well. When one small community decides to support each other, others begin to learn from it. No one calls this a revolution, yet it feels like a new way of living slowly sprouting, adapting to the spiritual climate of this century. However, every transformation has a darker side. When you step out of old standards, you must face the empty spaces the system once filled with noise. When you stop seeking external approval, the question, "Who am I?" rises with its full weight. And the truth is, many of us were never taught how to live without relying on the judgments of others. We learn to live like mirrors, reflecting the expectations of society, family, and the world around us. When that mirror cracks, you cannot see a clear image. You only see a shadow standing before a light that has no name yet. This is where insecurity rises. People begin to realize that the hardest part of leaving a system is not changing habits, but changing identity. If you're no longer a successful person by the old definition, then who are you? If life is no longer driven by the pressure to prove yourself, then what guides you? These questions are like strong undercurrents, powerful enough to pull someone into deep waters if they do not have the patience to listen to themselves. But the beautiful thing is this: when people dare to stand in that water, to endure the uncertainty without rushing to escape it, a new self begins to form, a self not built on achievements or possessions, but on honesty. You see this in those who have gone through hardship and come out lighter, not because life became easier, but because they realize the most important thing is to live true to the deepest part of themselves. They walk more slowly now, but each step carries weight. On a broader scale, society is also standing in that water. No one knows exactly what the future will look like. No one knows whether the old system will fall quickly or slowly, or whether it will reshape itself to survive. No one knows if the new models will be complete or just drafts of something that will come later. But one thing is becoming clearer each day. People no longer want a life driven by fear of not having enough. They want to be guided by something wider, deeper, more alive. And that is when you see clearly that the most powerful force shaking the old system is not economic collapse or political pressure, but the subtle shifts inside the human heart. When one person changes their needs, the market immediately shifts. When a community changes its values, policies slowly adjust. When a generation changes its story of what a meaningful life is, the entire structure of society must rethink its purpose. The world is in a strange in-between state, no longer fit to cling to the old, and not yet ready to fully trust the new. And in this space between, the most important thing is not knowing exactly where we are going, but knowing what makes us truly alive. Because from that place, the next chapter begins. A chapter where people no longer ask for a system that simply works better, but a system that reflects the growing soul within them. At this moment, when every outer and inner movement has merged into one point, you find yourself facing a truth you can no longer avoid. We are stepping into a time when the old questions are no longer enough to guide us. The system once built on competition, accumulation, and infinite growth now feels like a suit of armor that has grown too tight, squeezing the expanding soul of humanity. This is not an accusation or a gloomy forecast. It is simply the recognition that people no longer fit the frame they have worn for generations. When the inner world changes, the structures around it must change. No system can resist that forever. The signs are everywhere. You see them in small conversations about living more gently. You see them when someone dares to say for the first time that they do not want what society insists they should want. You see them in the young who leave the city for quieter places, not to escape, but to reclaim the true rhythm of life. You see them in those who have walked through storms and discovered that real success is not found in fame or wealth, but in the ability to touch the deepest parts of their own heart. In those moments, you understand that the collapse of a system is not an ending. It is a turning. Everything old, no matter how large, eventually must dissolve to make space for something more fitting. And in that transition, humanity is invited to look inward and ask, what truly nourishes me? What makes me feel alive? What allows me to look toward tomorrow with softness instead of fear? Looking back at the journey of humanity, You see that every time a model dissolves, a new one begins to form, not from meetings of the powerful, but from the quiet movements of ordinary people. A child asking their parents what matters more, money or time. A group of friends choosing to share what they have instead of buying more. An elder telling their grandchildren stories of a time when people relied on each other more than on markets. These simple actions are like drops of water falling onto stone, not changing it immediately, but carving new lines into the surface of reality over time. Those lines are coming together into a shape that grows clearer each day. People want a world where value is not measured by busyness, where happiness is not a personal project, where kindness is not treated as a luxury, a world where people can live without feeling they must fight constantly, where children do not have to grow up under the pressure to be the best, but only to be true, where older people are not left behind but are seen as keepers of memory and wisdom. You can feel this shift in the air like a gentle pull, drawing people toward connection. From planting a few vegetables in the yard, to small gatherings where people talk about feelings instead of achievements, to communities building shared gardens. These things are not economic solutions, but they are the spiritual foundation a new system needs. Because a society is truly steady only when it is built on hearts capable of love, not hearts exhausted from chasing accomplishments. Sometimes you may feel fear when thinking about the collapse of the old. That is natural. Confusion is the mind's reaction when standing at the threshold of the unknown. But notice this. The fear is always accompanied by a lightness, as if something deep within knows that something better is waiting. Not a perfect paradise, but a more honest life. Not a new system appearing at once, but small steps steady enough to lead us out of the shadows and closer to the part of us that has always wanted to live freely. Perhaps the most important thing we can do now is not predict the future, but create it piece by piece by living more truthfully. When you dare to question, when you dare to refuse what no longer fits, when you choose kindness over competition, when you choose sharing over hoarding, you are placing a stone into the foundation of the new world, a world not built from fear of lack, but from trust that people can be good to one another without being forced. Looking ahead, you see no clear map, but you do see a soft, steady light shining from the small decisions you and millions of others make each day. That light does not burst like fireworks. It spreads like dawn, slow but certain. It does not illuminate grand projects, but simple moments. The hug of a friend, a family meal, the laughter of children, an afternoon without rushing. Maybe that is why the question is no longer whether capitalism will collapse. The real question is, what will we build when it passes? And standing before that question, you recognize something profound. The strongest system in the world has never been an economic one, but the human heart when it finally awakens. Once that heart opens, no structure is large enough to contain it. And perhaps this is the beginning of the next chapter of humanity, a chapter written one small, honest decision at a time. Lines not aiming for perfection, but for freedom. Not striving for domination, but for harmony. Not seeking to conquer the world, but to belong to it more gently. If collapse is inevitable, then renewal is too. And from the moment you realize this, the future is no longer something to fear, but something quietly inviting you forward.
Thank you for staying with me until the very end of this story. If this message touched your heart, please give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you'll never miss the next journey we take together. Your support means the world to me.